All right, so I'm Cris. I am a sophomore here at the College of Worcester, and I am genderqueer. I came out when I was 17, when I first got here. This thing is really weird. All right, so I came out when I was 17, and the thing that you realize when you identify as queer is that you have to come out a lot. Every time you meet a new friend, to new classmates, new professors, roommates, to your parents repeatedly. And people get gay, they get lesbian, they kind of get bisexual, they can understand trans, but when it comes to questioning something like, what do you mean you're not a boy or a girl, it's suddenly a lot more difficult. And that is because this is the system that we use. I think most of us can recognize that this binary is something that exists in our life, but it's also kind of invisible. We don't question this basic premise that we use when we talk about things like gender bias and the wage gap and sexism. This is always in the background of our mind, that there are two genders, man and woman, each of which is characterized by certain behaviors, manners of dress, even jobs. This is also conflated with the sex binary. Okay, thank you. Yeah, this thing's really weird. All right, that's better. Okay. So it's conflated with the sex binary, which is this idea that there are two distinct sexes and that this is a biological phenomenon, when in reality, the sex binary is much more of a social construct that does not fully reflect the variety of our human population. But for a lot of people, sex and gender are the same thing, and they both fit into that binary, that there are two distinct categories don't blend, they're different, they're separate, and everybody fits that. So when I try to explain to people that that's not really true and that doesn't, describe all people, the easiest place to start is with the sex binary, which looks kind of like this. So sex is a lot more complex than we generally consider it. Most people, you say sex, they think penis or vagina. Sex is actually composed of chromosomes, physical characteristics, secondary sex characteristics, gonads, what hormonal system dominates, and then, so this is what most people consider sex, and then on the bottom, the two genders that are aligned with those sexes. The reality of sex, as well as gender, is that it looks something a lot more like this, where any individual can have a large variety of different characteristics. It's actually really interesting because if you take two people that are assigned female at birth and compare them to each other, there will be more variation between them than between someone assigned male at birth and someone assigned female at birth. So obviously, the sex binary does not describe the human existence as a species. So when you try to use that as justification for a gender binary, that kind of falls flat. Gender is also very much culturally shaped. So the system of gender that we have, the gender roles and expectations that we have, even things as arbitrary as the colors that we assign to the genders, is not the same as that in different cultures. And there have been cultures throughout history and across the globe that have had non-binary systems. For instance, in India, there are the Hijras, who are assigned male at birth but live their lives. They aren't women, but they aren't men. They have a third role in society, and recently they actually have been recognized as a third gender there. And a lot of these people, for instance, the Native American Two-Spirits, have also held roles similar to shaman. They're leaders and spiritual people for their communities. But recently, well, not that recently, this idea these people have been eliminated by things like imperialism, colonialization, and slavery. And the sex-gender binary has actually been used as a tool to lead to imperialism and slavery. And a lot of this great variation in these different systems and these different existences have been destroyed intentionally. And so we're left with the sex-gender binary, which again is very much a Euro-Western idea, but because of the influence that Europe and America has had on the rest of the world, it's become much more accepted in other places, which makes it very difficult for people that don't fit this to live their lives safely and happily. So the second part of the sex-gender binary is this idea of masculinity and femininity, that there are certain things that are masculine and there are certain things that are feminine, and that is immutable and, you know, again, just the way things are. Men like sports and women like shopping. Yeah. So this starts at birth, this process. And even, well, now with recent technology, this starts before birth. So I was born, and the midwife said, it's a girl, because I had a vagina. And now there are little F's on all of my identification. And I got lots of pink toys. And then it influences the opportunities you're given in all arenas of your life. What activities you're allowed to participate in. For instance, well, this isn't as much a problem for me, but I know a lot of my friends that were girls weren't allowed to like wrestle or things like that. Luckily, my dad is a carpenter and kind of raised me to be his son. Joke's on him, because he was right. But luckily, I was able to not be quite as confined to these ideas. The gender binary influences how you're treated in school, what you're expected to do well in, how you're expected to behave at school, what degrees you're expected to pursue. I still can't tell you how many people are surprised that I like science. I do. It influences what friends you have. And again, that influences, you know, how you grow as a person. For instance, a lot of parents don't let their girls have sleepovers with boys, even when they're like 7. You know, they're not gonna do anything like they're kids. So it also influences how people treat you. And this may be one of the biggest issues when you think about the way that people are treated, because it influences so greatly how you develop as a person. There's a study, the Baby X study, where people were shown a video of a little baby crying, and when told it was a boy, they perceived the baby as angry. When told it was a girl, they perceived the baby as scared. And that influences a lot of how we develop, because, for instance, in my own life, people have expected me to be weak, to be quiet and docile, because I was raised as a girl. And luckily, I've been quite pleased to shatter all of those illusions. But that, you know, it has a huge impact on finally who we become in our lives, because if you grow up long enough with people telling you that you're supposed to be one way and you're supposed to act one way, and you're actively punished for not fitting those ideals, it's a lot harder to be yourself. So as dialogue about gender has become slightly more common, you'll hear a lot of people say things like, gender is a spectrum. This is a nice starting place, because we begin to see that it's not as simple as man and woman. However, the main problem with this is that it posits masculinity and femininity as opposites. And that isn't necessarily true. The other problem with this is that the more female you get, the less male you are, which again isn't necessarily true. So the next step is something that looks like this, which allows for the ability to have both masculine and feminine traits without those somehow detracting from each other. So for instance, I would place myself probably something like that, although probably scooted a little bit more that way on the feminine end. But again, the problem is we're trying to describe things that exist outside of the binary while talking in the binary. So what happens if somebody feels, oh, like they're up there? This cannot hold those people because again, it still relies on this binary, this dichotomy that is too rigid to fully hold all people. So the model that I am a big fan of looks like this. So people who do not identify as having a gender are in the black. People that identify with all genders are that white circle. And so you can see there's male, female, the blend, and then people that are neither as well. And this allows a lot more nuance to people's identities and to explain who we are and who we can be. So, believe it or not, this was me. Before I came out, these were my senior pictures. I was 17 at the time. I came out as bisexual when I was 16, and I then began to learn about different queer identities, which was when I first came upon the idea of transgender individuals. And while I sympathized a lot with things that trans people said, I knew to myself that I couldn't call myself a boy because it wasn't right. It wasn't who I was. But I also knew that I wasn't a girl. And that was what led me to learning about non-binary identities and finally being able to express who I really am. So a large part of how I express this has to do with, there's a lot of fluidity. So these two pictures are me on the same day. Man, I like wearing dresses, but some days I bind my chest and dress traditionally in masculine ways. I generally try to present androgynously or with high levels of both masculine and feminine coded things. So I like makeup a lot, which again confuses people. When I first came out to my dad, he's like, well, you're a boy now, you're not supposed to like those things. And I was like, no, you missed the whole point. The point is that I don't have to fit those ideas about men and women, but can rather just be myself and exist beyond those. So I can use makeup to look like this, but I can also use makeup to look like this, which is really great. Most of the time, I look something like that. You know, I just kind of exist, which is nice. And I don't have to worry about ideas like what I'm supposed to do because of how I look or what I was assigned at birth, which is really great. So what I want people to come away from this is learning to think about the binary critically and to really be aware of all of the different things that it influences in our life, as well as how we can each, challenge it a bit. So think about, why do I do certain things? Why do I wear certain things? Are those, is that really who I am, or is it because this is what I've been taught since birth? Is it because this is what is expected of me? Do I feel comfortable in how I'm expressing myself, or do I feel like something's being held back? Do I feel confined in the roles that are prescribed to me? Do I feel that I can exist as a whole person instead of as a man or a woman? Because what it comes down to is we teach children to be good men and good women, but we ignore the fact that, one, those are two separate things, and also that that's not the same as being a good person and being a whole person. And lastly, what scares you? I'm not gonna lie, there are ramifications for pushing the boundaries of the binary. People are very invested in it, and people don't like being uncomfortable. People don't like not being sure. People want to be able to put you into a box. And when you don't fit neatly, people react with anger and hatred, which is why I do my part to educate everyone I can, because I really believe that education is the way to treat that sort of ignorance. So ways you can challenge the binary. Don't assume anyone's gender. It doesn't matter if they look like the most feminine Barbie girl ever. Don't assume. Clothes don't define your gender. Your body doesn't define your gender. You are the only person that can define your gender for yourself. Don't make assumptions about how people of a certain gender should act or look. Do things that aren't what you're supposed to do. So say you were raised as a boy, but you always wanted to learn how to bake cupcakes. Do it. And if people are like, well, you're a man, you can't do that, be like, no, just do it. Do things that you have maybe never even thought of, things like putting on makeup. It takes a lot more work than a lot of people think it does. You know, go out and help somebody build a house. Do things that aren't what you're supposed to do to figure out, you know, is that something that maybe you've been missing because of how you're raised? And question other people when they make assumptions about people because of this idea of gender and sex that we have. And also, the future. Kids are awesome. I've worked with kids for several summers, and surprisingly, they are very open to ideas like this. And one of my goals is to be able to raise a generation that isn't as confined as we are in terms of gender, so that these things aren't dictated by what they're supposed to be, but rather by the choices that the child has made for themselves. So a lot of people, when they hear things like gender neutral parenting, they think that you're trying to like raise your kid to be like agender or something, when in reality, it's much more about giving them all the choices that they want, that they could possibly choose from. So there's nothing wrong with a little girl being very feminine and loving Barbie and Cinderella. The problem is that's often the only choice they have, and they're punished when they don't meet those expectations. So I look forward to a future when instead of, you know, little pink and blue people, we have a bunch of people who aren't as confined as we were, who aren't scared to do things because that's not what men are supposed to do, who aren't held to these restrictive standards about what you can wear and do and say, and so people can truly be themselves without having to, you know, fit into a box. Thank you.